Hi, this is Kim Newlove, host of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Thank you for joining me for episode 132. You can find the show notes with links to anything mentioned today on my website, thepharmacistvoice.com. I'm publishing a different kind of an episode today because I'm celebrating 2 full years in podcasting. Cue the fireworks. If you're new to the show, welcome. This is a great episode to start with. First, I'll share a little bit about me. Next, I'll share some history about the podcast, like when and why I started it, who it's for, and what I want listeners to do with the information. Then I'll share some of the struggles that I've worked through in my first 2 years of this podcast. That's right, it hasn't always been smooth sailing. And why would I want anyone to know that it hasn't been smooth sailing? Why would I want anyone to know that I've struggled? Because this is a journey-style podcast, and I share what I've learned from point A to point B. In this case, I'll share some of the hard-won lessons from 2 years of podcasting. Life is less interesting without struggles anyway, right? So let's talk about the struggles. And finally, I'll wrap it up with what's coming up as I begin my 3rd year in podcasting. First, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Anytime I'm interviewed for a podcast hosted by somebody else, the first line of my bio says, Kim Newlove is a pharmacist, voice actor, podcast host, wife, mom of 2 teenage boys, and a volunteer. That pretty much sums it up. But wait, there's more. I'll just tell you more, okay? I have been an Ohio licensed pharmacist for 20 years. I graduated with my Bachelor of Science degree in pharmacy from the University of Toledo College of Pharmacy in 2001. I am 43 years old, and I currently live in the greater Toledo, Ohio area. If you don't know where that is, let me just explain real quick. I'm right where the Ohio-Michigan border touches the westernmost point of Lake Erie. I'm about 60 minutes from Canada, and I have both a Midwestern accent and a Great Lakes accent. It's a little bit Midwest and a little bit Canadian. How about my family life? My husband and I have been together since 1993. It's been almost 30 years, but we've only been married for 20 years. We have 2 teenaged sons. I think I already mentioned that. Craig is 18 and Derek is 16. Craig has autism, and he is on the lower functioning end of the autism spectrum. He cannot read, write, or speak, but he loves it when anyone reads to him. Craig uses a communication device. He touches a picture, and the device speaks words. If you've never seen one before, it's called an Accent 1000. It's made by the Prentke Romich company. I'll put a link in the show notes. In my podcast intro, I usually mention that I was inspired by my nonverbal teenaged son, Craig, who has autism, to combine my identity as a pharmacist with my speaking voice and launch my voiceover business, The Pharmacist Voice, in 2017. Watching Craig struggle to communicate over the past 2 decades has really helped me realize the power of having a voice and using it. Something as simple as speaking, which we all totally take for granted, is what I now get paid to do. I have trained to perform as a voice actor, and I've also learned how to run a small business, a voiceover business. I am a pharmacist who uses her voice professionally, hence the company name, The Pharmacist Voice. What kind of projects do I work on? Among other things, I narrate audiobooks for women pharmacist authors, and I provide medical narration to clients in the pharmaceutical and biotech industries. Let's move on to the history of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. The first ever episode of the Pharmacist Voice podcast was published in December 2019. I was just trying to get listed in iTunes, as it was called at the time, before the end of 2019. Hey, mission accomplished. I got in. Then I needed a break for Christmas and catching up when my kids went back to school. But then eventually I started publishing episodes weekly around the third week of January 2020, and I haven't missed a week since. I say that with a smile on my face. I know I don't have to show up every week, but I do because I want to. I have really grown to love the challenge of publishing an episode every week, and I plan to keep the same schedule for the next 12 months. In the intro today, I mentioned that I'd explain why I started this podcast, who it's for, and what I want listeners to do with the information. Here goes. I started this podcast for a few reasons. Before I get into them, I want you to know that you can hear the expanded version of what I'm about to say in episode 24 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. The title of the podcast episode is Why I Started a Podcast. FYI, episode 24 was published in June 2020. The top 3 reasons I started a podcast are 1. Because a pharmacist podcaster friend suggested I look into starting a podcast. Her name is Dr. Erin L. Albert. She knows I credit her with this, and Erin, if you're listening, thanks again. 2. I started a podcast for branding for my business. Now, specifically, I wanted to brand myself as a pharmacist, voice actor, and podcast host in the minds of my listeners. Just by having a podcast, I think I've actually accomplished that goal. However, when I talk about being a pharmacist, a voice actor, a podcast host, or my transition from pharmacist to voice actor and podcast host, I personally think it further brands who I am into the minds of my listeners. And 3. For networking. I love to connect with people. By the way, thank you to all my guests who have taken the time to be on my show over the last 2 years. My interview shows give me a chance to have conversations with amazing people, including dozens of pharmacists who use their voices to advocate for something, educate in some way, or entertain. They might advocate for entrepreneurship or health in retirement or something else. They might educate patients, or they may educate other pharmacists on how to do something, like start their own wellness practice. Plus, some of my guests entertain. One of my favorites is Mike Lenz. He's a pharmacist, voice actor, and podcast host. Sound like anybody? That's episode 41 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Mike entertains audiences with his podcast and also the audiobooks that he records. In summary, I started the Pharmacist Voice podcast for 3 reasons. A trusted friend suggested it, the podcast is a branding tool, and it also helps me network. Who is the Pharmacist Voice podcast for? Great question, right? Who's my intended audience? My intended audience is pharmacists, pharmacy students, pharmacy technicians, and voice actors who are in the medical space. Anyone is welcome to listen, of course, but when I record my shows, I've got pharmacy people and voice actors in the medical space in my mind. What do I want you, the listener, to do with the information in this podcast? The number one thing I want you to do is be inspired to use your voice. That means I want you to feel inspired to use your expertise, your passion, for something that you feel is worthwhile. I am using my voice for something other than traditional clinical practice. If you want to do something other than traditional clinical practice, I want you to feel inspired to pursue it. My interview shows feature others, and they're not always pharmacists. The goal is for them to inspire you to use your voice too. I personally wear a lot of hats, and I bet you do too. Even as a volunteer, I get to use my voice. Speaking up and making a difference doesn't always have to be a paid gig. In hindsight, I have had some amazing opportunities as a volunteer. But no matter what I have done, I want you to feel like what you do with your voice has value. There is power in having a voice and using it. So, use yours. In case you're wondering how I've volunteered, I'll give you a small snapshot. For example, I have been part of my county's addiction task force. That has allowed me to bring in speakers on harm reduction and medical marijuana. And another thing that I did, actually 3 times, I created 3 faith community discussions about opioid addiction. On a different topic, I've done poisoning prevention education at the elementary school and high school levels. Plus, I've done poisoning prevention at health fairs. I absolutely love that, by the way, and I love getting students involved. Pharmacy students. It's great. I have also donated blood at Red Cross blood drives. I think I'm at 6.5 gallons. What else have I done? I have been an elementary school and high school career day speaker. That's always lots of fun. Another thing that I did was I helped call a pastor to my church. Some people call it hiring a pastor. Apparently, it's called calling a pastor. And I thought it had nothing to do with the world of pharmacy, but there are so many lessons that I have learned that I can apply to pharmacy that I must say that I was wrong. I thought it had nothing to do with pharmacy, but I was wrong. And I'll tell you, the biggest lesson I believe that I learned was that it's okay for someone to have a passion about something without making it the church's passion. Much like an individual pharmacist, it's okay for them to have a passion without making it a passion for the entire profession. That, I thought, was a very important lesson to learn. What else have I done? I have been a keynote speaker at a pharmacy camp for a pharmacy school, the University of Toledo College of Pharmacy. And there's so many other things that I've done. And looking back on it, I really enjoyed all of my volunteer experiences, and I'm really proud of what I've done with my voice. And I hope all of this explanation helps inspire you that whatever you do with your voice has value too, even if you're a volunteer. All right, we talked about what I do want you to do with this podcast, which is be inspired. What I do not want listeners to do with the information in this podcast is I do not want them to hear what I am not saying. Thank you, Dr. Adam Martin, the Fit Pharmacist. I love that phrase. I am not the voice of the pharmacy profession. Okay, this podcast is not about me trying to position myself as the voice of the pharmacy profession. I am all about inspiring people to use their voices. Thank you for listening to me clear that up. It's important to me. Next up, I'll share some of the struggles that I've worked through in the first 2 years of the Pharmacist's Voice podcast. As I mentioned in the intro today, it hasn't always been smooth sailing. I share this because I believe that it is okay to be vulnerable. I believe that my sharing some of my less than perfect moments will help others feel more accepting of themselves. We all struggle in some ways. It's okay. You've still got your voice, and there is still power in using it. For some of us, it's just a little harder to move forward with what we want to say. What I'm about to share is not easy for me. It's not pretty, but here we go. What do I struggle with? 4 main things. 1, I struggle with carrying the conversation all by myself on solo shows. 2, finding time to podcast. 3, audio engineering. And 4, voice issues like muscle tension dysphonia and losing my voice after a cold. I'll go into some detail on each of these, but I'll try to keep the stories brief. Let's start with carrying the conversation all by myself on solo shows, such as this one. When I have a script for a project, like an audiobook, it's way easier for me to talk to myself in a room. Scripts are already organized and final. It's from a book that's been published. Sitting in a room and saying what I really want to say for a podcast right on the spot can be hard for me. Here's a little behind the scenes for you. For my first episode, I scripted most of it because I was not used to talking about myself to a microphone in a recording space with no one watching. I am a reactor, not a generator. I'll publish an entire episode on the topic of generators and reactors this year, But for now, I'll just share that generators are your typical radio hosts who can talk to themselves all day long and sound like they just ate a bowl of sugar. Lots of energy, right? You know the type, morning show hosts. All of that energy comes from inside a generator. They generate their own energy with no one else around. Reactors, on the other hand, are like me. They do a better job speaking to someone else. I am definitely a reactor. I laugh because that's nervous energy coming out. I actually don't know if people like the way that these episodes come out because I don't get a lot of feedback. But let me ask you something. Did you even realize that there are at least two types of personalities when it comes to broadcasting, generators and reactors? I sure didn't. This was a revelation just this year, in 2022. I learned about generators and reactors as I was reading the book Beyond Powerful Radio by Valerie. It's actually a very long book, and I'm listening to the audiobook, but hey, I claim that I'm reading it, and I'm somewhere in the first 25% of it. But I learned about reactors and generators from Valerie. Now, if you haven't heard of Valerie, she is a broadcasting consultant, and Beyond Powerful Radio, her book, is a how-to cookbook for broadcasters who want to learn the craft and improve. Links in the show notes. It's not hard to share what I've learned during my career change from pharmacist to voice actor, or stories about being a pharmacist, a voice actor, and a podcast host. What's hard is giving up the control of telling the story the exact way I want to tell it. I at least like to think through the episode and have an outline before I press record. Now, in the beginning, I darn near scripted entire episodes. Now, I give myself outlines or a few sentences to launch off of. At times, I have gone into my recording space without a plan. A really good example of that is episode 130. I had no time to plan, and the episode was really long. If I had it to do all over again, I think I could have done better, but I'll never redo it. It was a lesson hard won. I can get it done without planning, and that's a win. In my opinion, it takes guts to go in and record a podcast without any prep. I personally think it's kind of risky to record without a plan. I run the risk of looking like I don't know what I'm talking about, and I don't like that feeling, especially when I repeat myself and I talk in circles. I really like to get to the point. It's just my personality. It bothers me when I have to stop and give backstory in the middle of a story. Having an outline or a few sentences to launch off of seems to really work well for me. The second thing I mentioned was finding time to podcast. We're all busy, right? I don't want to dwell on this for long. It's as simple as it sounds. I have a lot of responsibilities, and there are only so many hours in a day. I believe I've mentioned on other episodes that I only work about 3 hours a day. We're only talking about Monday through Friday, so that's about 15 hours a week. When there are school breaks, school delays, days off, like President's Day, teacher work days, snow days, etc., or maybe weekends or other reasons, I can't work. I simply can't work. On days like that, there's just too much going on with the family. Weekends especially, grocery shopping, kids' activities, family obligations, church obligations. I won't go on. Everybody's got their own thing going on, and I certainly do too. Now, the podcast is only one small piece of my 15-hour work week. The podcast takes maybe 3 hours out of that work week. There's some preparation, recording time, and so on. It's 20% of my work week. And I can only do it when the house is quiet and I'm not interrupted. It's not something you can do at the pharmacy counter when people are interrupting you to ask where the bathroom is or how long it's going to be for a prescription. It's just different. I won't get into the details. Just know that finding a quiet time to record, edit, and produce a show and create show notes and episode artwork and upload everything to my podcast host takes time. I can't be a perfectionist about it. I just have to get it done. If you want to hear more about the nitty-gritty on how long it takes to create a podcast episode from idea to published, listen to episode 126 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. There's a link in the show notes. What else have I struggled with? I have struggled with audio engineering. It takes a lot of time to learn how to efficiently record, edit, and produce podcast episodes. Anybody listening who has done it knows. Now, after 3 years or almost 3 years of using the same recording software and equipment, I am the most efficient that I have ever been right now. I'm not trying to brag, but I'm sure that you can imagine the skills that I now have after recording on a regular basis for years. I've got some of the kinks worked out, like using the right amount of gain and compression so that my voice sounds more normal. I've gone back and listened to some of my older episodes. I'm not going to fix them, but I had too much compression. I'll admit it, but you learn as you go. I have really dialed it in over the years, and I look forward to seeing how much more I can improve my sound in the future. Being able to cancel echoes from guests and make the guests sound just as loud and as good as me takes skill. And I'm happy to say that struggling to learn how to correct those issues has turned me into a solid audio engineer. 2 other things that I have struggled with are directly related to my voice. Oh, the irony, right? I'm a professional voice user. Now, here's the first one. I lose my voice every time I have a cold. Usually after the cold, but it takes a good week for it to come back. Unfortunately, there is nothing I can do to prevent this from happening, and I can't get over it any faster than I do. It's just ironic that it happens, and I'll leave it at that. The other thing that I have struggled with that is directly related to my voice is muscle tension dysphonia. What is muscle tension dysphonia? This is my own words here. It's when your voice sounds funny because you have too much muscle tension in your throat area. I believe I mentioned that I have this in May or June of 2021. I actually had to go to voice therapy for several weeks, not once, but twice. When I was narrating my first full-length audiobook in the spring of 2021, my throat hurt all the time after narrating. Plus, I would need a day to recover after narrating just one chapter, which was only about 12 pages. Now, this is embarrassing to admit, but it's true. What I learned through voice therapy with a speech therapist is that I was breathing in a way that was not supporting my voice. I was breathing with my chest instead of my diaphragm. Long story short, there were exercises that helped, so I'm happy to say that I am in recovery, and I'm in a lot better shape now than I was when I started therapy. You would think that I learned everything I needed in the first wave of therapy, right? And I almost did. But I had a respiratory illness in late summer that hung around for most of the fall, and it landed me back in voice therapy. I never had a positive COVID test, but I will tell you that what happened to me matched long hauler syndrome, including shortness of breath, chest pain, and some really unusual issues like the inability to swallow properly. I continued the podcast all through this, but I would only speak a few sentences, and then I'd be huffing and puffing in here trying to catch my breath. Now, with everything that I overcame with that illness and the second round of voice therapy, I feel much more confident as a voice user now. I'd like to have my speech therapist on my podcast at some point to talk about this, the muscle tension dysphonia and the treatment, but there's no interview planned yet. Now, let me say that this may seem like something that doesn't affect you as a pharmacist, but I must say that pharmacists use their voices all day long, right? I would bet that there's at least one pharmacist, pharmacy student, pharmacy technician, or even a voice actor listening to this who's going to be interested in learning more about muscle tension dysphonia. If that's you, feel free to reach out to me and let me know. How do you get in touch with me, you may be asking? Just go to thepharmacistvoice.com and either leave a message using the contact form or leave a voicemail for me. I'd like to hear if you're interested in hearing more about muscle tension dysphonia. Before we move on, I just want to do a quick recap about my struggles. Number 1, I have struggled with solo shows, but I'm improving over time. 2, finding time to podcast is a struggle. 3, audio engineering took time for me to learn, but I've improved and I've still got a little ways to go. And 4, I have struggled with 2 vocal issues. They are losing my voice after a cold and muscle tension dysphonia. Let's move on. I'll wrap up this episode by talking about what's coming up as I begin my 3rd year in podcasting. In 2022, I will continue to publish episodes on a weekly basis. I still plan to have solo shows and interview shows, but I might not alternate them every week. I really like publishing series of shows, and I plan to do more of that in 2022, so that's going to interrupt some of the solo shows. For example, in the month of May, I plan to have a Pharmacist Mom series, and in the month of June, I plan to have a Pharmacist Dad series. During my solo shows, I will still talk about my career transition and what I've learned. Anyone who is pursuing a second career will get something out of that. In the past, I have talked about things like hiring a graphic designer to create my company logo, having accountability partners, and other topics. Those are all good for second career individuals. Plus, I will talk about being a pharmacist or a voice actor or a podcast host during some episodes. It works for me, so I'll keep doing it. I can't tell you how many times someone will ask me a question about something that I covered in a podcast. Not only will I give them a 2-minute version right away in an email or during a phone call, but I'll also point them in the direction of a podcast episode that addresses that issue. Listeners have contacted me about all kinds of stuff, like getting started in voiceover, or starting a podcast, or buying a microphone for podcasting, or even recording software. It's nice for them to be able to rewind and replay the answer from a podcast episode, or read the show notes to access a link to a product, or read about the terminology that I used in my answer. I also plan to keep doing seasonal updates. I started this in the summer of 2021, I believe. I'll do a winter update in February, so that's next month. Then I'll do a spring, summer, and fall update later this year. What those do is they dig into what's going on with my family, my production schedule, and anything else a little more personal that I want to say. Also this year, I'd like to do some drug name pronunciation episodes. They might be shorter episodes, but I still think they'll have value. Sounding confident pronouncing drug names and feeling less frustrated learning them has value, so I'll try publishing some of those. Another thing I may try in 2022 is NaPodPoMo, or NaPodPoMo, however you pronounce it. NaPodPoMo stands for National Podcast Post Month. It's an annual challenge to publish 30 podcast episodes in 30 days. Now, I did this in November 2020. I would like to do it in November 2022. It is hard to do, but that's why it's called a challenge. I've been working with a super secret future guest who's helping me recruit guests. If it doesn't work out, I'll just do a series. But if it does work out, I think it'll have a lot of value for listeners. So keep an eye out for that in November 2022. That's all I've got for today. Thank you for listening to episode 132 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Today, I celebrated 2 years in podcasting. Hooray! This milestone has given me the opportunity to pause and share the history of this podcast, why I started it, who it's for, what I want listeners to do with the information I share, some of my struggles, and what's next for the podcast. Please visit thepharmacistvoice.com to read the show notes. Links to previously published episodes of the Pharmacist Voice podcast, my social media links, and more are in those show notes. And one last thing, word of mouth is still a great way to share information. So if you liked this episode, please share it with a friend. And subscribe to or follow the Pharmacist Voice podcast in your favorite podcast player to get each new episode delivered to your smartphone every time a new episode comes out. Thank you again for listening.